Hi everyone. This lecture covers the dietary culture of the Meiji period, Meiji being from 1868 to 1912. Meiji was a period of drastic reshaping of society, of politics in Japan, and there's a lot of interesting things happening with food culture too, and that's the focus of what I'm going to talk about today. So my overall question is, what was dietary culture like in the Meiji period? We'll look at the pattern of daily meals, the addition of Western foods like meat and bread to the diet, the role that women came to be defined as caregivers and food preparers in the household, and then look at the Meiji gourmet boom and the evolution of this concept of the midday meal called lunch. And that's the focus for today. One thing, though, uh, we have to realize immediately is that things didn't change overnight. This is a description of a meal from the 1930s. And you can see that this typical meal, everything was pretty much the same: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The usual staple was barley cooked with rice, and that ratio of rice to barley really depended upon where you lived. In the countryside, people ate more barley. In the city, they ate more rice. But along with that, there would be a soup, side dish, pickles, and lunch consisted of leftovers. So this is a description from the 1930s, as I said, and it would resonate with people living in the 1830s too. So the moral of the story here is that things did not change immediately for most of the population overnight in the Meiji, despite all the things that are happening in society, introduction of new foods. On the basic fundamental level, food culture was very much the same in the 1830s as it was in the 1930s post-Meiji. So it's something to keep in mind. And that's true of food preparation, specifically of rice. Um, People in the 1920s or 1930s probably only made rice once a day. And there are lots of reasons for that. But that was the pattern of the 19th century as well. Some of the reasons is that a lot of people lived in small houses and it's difficult to prepare rice and other dishes. Plus, there's the cost of the fuel to heat the rice, and it's just a lot of work to make rice over a stove. So typically, depending on where you lived, you made rice once a day. And in Osaka and Kyoto, that rice was for the noonday meal. And then the rest of the time they ate the leftover rice. And in Edo or Tokyo, usually that was in the morning, people would make a rice and they'd eat leftovers. So rice cooking is something that happened just once a day. And that's a great continuity from the Edo period, the early modern period, into the modern period, into the 20th century. People are using wood stoves. Gas cookers are introduced in 1904, 1905, but those are very expensive. So cooking rice, you have to use an appliance like the stove, the kamado here, and it takes a lot of fuel and energy and patience. And so no wonder people would only make rice once a day. And as noted earlier, a lot of the meals were the same. We think of Japan as having a wonderful gourmet culture, but if you're living in the countryside or you're living in the cities, most likely you're eating the same thing meal after meal after meal. Lunch would be leftovers. Here's a lunch of leftovers from 1931, consisting of rice with soybeans, salmon, daikon, and some taro. So rather simple stuff. Oops. Rather simple stuff. So something to keep in mind. that was hardly very gourmet into the 1930s. Actually, not until the 1960s did people have more gourmet meals. But as I said earlier, there are new foods that are introduced into the Meiji period, and those include beef and pork. Now, people had eaten those before in Japan, especially depending on the location. But sometimes beef eating was considered taboo. There wasn't any kind of ranch culture in Japan, but people did eat it in the early modern period. They would eat it for health benefits. Uh, and indeed, the first beef stew restaurant opens up before the Meiji period. Well, attitudes changed in the Meiji period. There's more interested in trying to westernize the diet. In 1872, the emperor was made to declare that he ate beef and pork, sort of set the tone that these dishes were okay, these foods were okay. But around that time, there's no cattle industry. So if you wanted to get a cow in Japan, I mean, there were a few pulling plows, but those not enough to make enough beef for people. So a lot of beef had to be imported. And then gradually, stock breeders opened up near Kobe, famous Western port, and that was the origin of Kobe beef. Probably, though, more important than the emperor symbolically declaring that he was eating meat was the fact that meat is introduced into the rations of the Navy and became more popularized that way. We do see the slow growth of butchers and meat sellers in the 1870s and early Meiji years, and Western style restaurants and hotels started serving beef stew and similar dishes. So this is an important development, but again, we have to keep this in perspective, and I'll give you some specifics, data specifics about that in just a second. So it's something new, but it didn't really revolutionize the diet immediately. One thing we do see, though, in these new treaty ports of Yokohama and Kobe, Nagasaki, is the development of Western style restaurants, Western style foods, initially to appeal to Western residents. And then gradually that spread to Japanese people who wanted to try these dishes. This term of Japanese Western food is called yoshoku, and that was a term that's coined in the Meiji period. And the contrast to that was also coined, this notion of washoku, or nihonshoku, or nihon ryori, meaning Japanese cuisine. So the terms for Western food and Japanese food really evolved together in the Meiji period. Now, Western restaurants opened, and they specialized in meat dishes, fatty dishes, foods cooked in oil, things that weren't found typically in the Japanese diet, but these restaurants nonetheless suited the Japanese palate. So instead of offering bread with foods, they would offer rice, and they'd serve beer or sake. One of the reasons people liked Western food is because it was focused on meat, focused on oils, focused on fats, focused on spices, things that many in the Meiji believed were important for building modern bodies. So whatever Japanese food was perceived to lack, Western food was perceived to be healthy. Imagine that. Fatty, fried in oil, meaty foods were considered healthy at the time. Here we have a Western style omelet with a beef stew on top. Looks pretty good. Here's some other famous developed dishes. Part of this culture of yoshoku, or Western food, was developing foods that suited the Japanese palate, so they're adaptations of Western dishes. So, for example, we have sukiyaki, or gyunabe, as it was called, beef stew. It's more of a Japanese style stew. It's based upon a fish stew. So here's a familiar way of eating fish that's been adapted to present beef to people. Koroke were popular Western style foods. These are fried potato cutlets. And then curry rice was considered a Western dish. It was a dish that the British introduced to the Japanese. The Japanese, when they made their curry, they added boiled meat and vegetables, and they thickened the sauce with more flour. So these were all efforts to try to tweak the recipes to make them appeal to Japanese consumers. Other very famous Meiji period Western style foods that remain part of the culinary repertoire in Japan are things like fried pork cutlet or tonkatsu, which is sort of Japanese schnitzel. There's hashed beef over rice, or hayashi rice. That's another Meiji dish. Um, but these are the top five, I would say. But let's have a reality check. In 1900, so right in the middle of Meiji, less than 15% of the protein that people ate in Japan came from animals. So most of the protein sources, 85%, are coming from grains. And despite the fact that beef and pork were okay to eat, hardly anybody ate them per capita. It's estimated that people consumed per capita 1 egg per person per month and less than a half teaspoon of milk per capita. So 99% of the population never drank milk around the year 1900. And we think of Japan as having a rich seafood diet. Well, if you lived far from the coast, you might never have seafood. It's kind of hard to imagine. Maybe you'd have some river fish occasionally, but seafood was a rarity until modern infrastructure developed to bring fresh fish to people all over the country, and that's in the post-war. So in 1900, the population is facing a nutritional deficit. Try to say that again. In 1900, the population is facing a nutritional deficiency. Young boys 10 years or older are 12% shorter in 1900 than they were in the year 2000. And life expectancy for most people, well, 43 years for men and 44 for women around the year 1900, which is similar to what it was in Italy at this time. So the diet had a lot lacking in it, despite all these new innovations. That's the lessons we need to learn. Not many people really, on a daily basis, ate meat or even eggs around in the middle of Meiji. But let's talk about something else. Let's talk about the arrival of baked goods. Besides having butcher shops open in the treaty ports of Kobe and Yokohama, many Westerners opened up bakeries to serve Western residents initially, and then gradually Japanese customers as well. And Japanese apprenticed with these bakers. One of the first was a man named Nakagawa Kahei, who opened up a butcher shop in 1866 and then started selling Western style sweets soon afterwards. One famous sweet shop that started selling Western foods was Fugetsudo, and that was a confectionery company that was making Japanese style sweets from the mid 1700s, but in the Meiji period started switching to bonbons and cookies around 1874, and it was the first to sell eclairs, and then of course to also sell choux cream, as we say in Japanese, or choux à la crème, or these little cream puffs. Fugetsudo became famous for that. Another famous baker was Fuji Rinemon, uh, who opened up a store called Fujiya in Yokohama in 1910. And this was the first bakery to sell British-style fruitcake at Christmas. In 1912, Fuji traveled to the United States. He spent a year working in the baking industry and returned to sell choux cream and eclairs. And it was the first, his was the first shop to offer shortcakes, these layered sponge cakes with whipped cream. And Fujiya became very famous for these sponge cakes sold at the Christmas time with strawberries. That was from the 1950s. Other bakery that became famous was a bakery called Donk, D-O-N-Q, which opened in 1905. That introduced French bread to the Japanese. And today Fujiya and Donku have outlets throughout Japan. So Western style baked goods and confectionery come in the Meiji period and take off. Ooh, and here I'll let you look at these assorted Western style sweets while I have a drink of water. Wish I had some cookies to go with it. All right, moving on. Here's Fujiya and their mascot, Peiko-chan. Had to show her. Fujiya famous for its milk candy. And here's another very famous baker of the Meiji period called Kimura, founded by Kimura Yasube, who opened a shop in Tokyo in 1869. And he was a baker, and he wanted to make something that suited the Japanese tastes. So rather than using yeast as a starter for his bread, he used koji. Koji, of course, is the mold inoculated grain used in sake making. And so he experimented with that as a starter. And actually, that was used as a starter back in the early modern period as well. But with his confectionery, he made a wonderful bun, a sweet bun, a azuki bean bun, filled with this azuki bean paste called an. And he invented in 1874 the anpan, the bean paste bread. And here we have a little mascot called Anpanman, who's a popular cartoon character in Japan. Getting hungry. Here's another Meiji period confection that became famous and has its own cartoon character. That's dorayaki, gong cake, literally. And it's basically two pancakes with sweetened bean paste, the sweetened an azuki inside, sandwiched, and their favorite of Doraemon, the cat. Here's another Meiji period confection. You can see I love talking about these things. And that's melon pan. Now, there's no melon in this, nor is there any chestnut. Melon pan is suggested. The way the term melon pan or melon pan comes from is the fact that it looks kind of like a musk melon. It is a bread dough topped with a cookie batter. So there's a crackling batter on the top. And when it bakes, it looks like a wonderful, expensive musk melon. Doesn't taste like a musk melon, though. Tastes more like a cookie, but it's really very tasty. Another name for it is sunshine bread. And it must be a distant cousin of the concha sweets that we see in Mexican bakeries in the United States. There must be a connection there someplace. I haven't been able to find it yet, but historically there must be some connection between melon bread and concha. So turning the page here to a different topic, looking at women and the role of food preparation in the household. And as you know, women were prohibited from voting in the Meiji period, and women could not even attend political meetings or rallies or discussions. So that does not mean the Meiji government didn't seek to mobilize women uh, in modernizing the country. Rather, what task the Meiji government gave women was their role in the household. They were supposed to be good wives and wise mothers. Their role is to defend the household and its traditional values and to be literate so they can raise good children who will become good citizens. And so the Meiji government promoted this concept of good wives and wives mothers, which did support women to gain more education, and it encouraged women to cook, to either learn how to cook by going to a cooking school. There was some cooking training in elementary school for women. And then there was also a whole market of culinary texts, of cookbooks that developed, written by and for women in the Meiji period. So the woman of the household is called the kate, and there's this new term called for housewife called shufu. And we'll see this word household come up again and again in writings about food in the Meiji period. Uh, as I said, women for the first time become the audience for cookbooks in the Meiji period. Now, in the early modern period, there were hundreds and hundreds of cookbooks written, but by and large, all the authors were men, as best as we can determine, and the audience was men too, either professional chefs or armchair gourmets, hardly women at all. But in the Meiji period, the first cookbooks are created by and for women. Some of these are used in cooking schools, others are written independently of those schools. And many of them were Western style cookbooks. So the first Western style cookbook debuts in 1872, and thereafter, from 1900, many cookbooks are written with women in mind. There are also women's cooking magazines that are published. So Fujin Gaho appears in 1905, Fujin no Tomo, Fujokai, 1910, all publications directed at women to encourage them to be good wives and wise mothers and learn how to cook. Because if they know how to cook well, that improves the household, improves the health of the family, helps to build good citizens. That's the government's mindset, at least. We also see changes in dining that happened in the Meiji period. You know, before this early modern period, a lot of people would eat separately. They ate whenever they could. They ate in separate rooms. Maybe dad would eat in one room, mom and the kids would eat in another room. Really depended on what kind of house you lived in, and how wealthy you were. But around 1900, Meiji social reformers are trying to encourage the family to dine together. And they develop a new style of dining called a tea table or chabudai. You can see this family sitting at this coffee table size table. Gathered around it, they're dining together. This is a shortened version of a Western dining table that you could fold up and put away, which is good if you live in a small place. And people would set out the table, put out all the bowls and other utensils. Each person has their own individual bowls and utensils. And then everyone has a place around the chabudai. And this is a moment when the family gathers together. They make conversation, which is something else that's new too for dining in the Meiji period. Maybe people didn't want to talk a lot in the early modern period, but they would gather and then Even if they didn't want to talk, they were supposed to hear edifying words from the man of the household. So he guides his family to be better people. At least that's the role model that developed in the Meiji period of families eating together around the tea table. Meiji also sees a gourmet boom, and that it really takes off with the work of a reporter named Murai Gensai, who authored a long-running novel called Kuidoraku, which first appeared in a newspaper syndication in 1903 and then was expanded into a four-volume book. This was one of the biggest bestsellers of the early 20th century. Murai Gensai was the greatest novelist until Natsume Soseki came along. But his novel focuses on the story of a couple, but also of actually a brother and sister who are both gourmands, and they're friends, and they're trying to raise up the level of cooking in Japan in their own way. But one of the features of this novel is that it included recipes. So Murai was a very interesting guy. He lived in California for a bit, but really it's his wife who introduced him to food as a theme in writing. And he really became a major culinary writer, Japan's first major culinary writer of the modern period. The sort of the moral of the story was that it was necessary to modernize and westernize the home. There's this character named Nakagawa in the novel, who with his sister Otowa become experts at Western and Japanese style cooking. And they take under their wing a gluttonous man from the countryside named Ohara and his obese and uncouth fiance Odai. And they help them to discover the pleasures of eating and cooking well. And it's a long story, but Murai emphasizes the importance of updating the kitchen. He even goes as far as saying you need to have a microscope to check on the quality of the food. And Murai was quite the promoter too. He made a kabuki version of this novel. He advertised the novel widely. He made a sequel to it, which didn't do as well. But this novel sparked off a lot of interest, and there was even restaurants named after some of the main characters. So sparked an interest in gourmet food. It even sparked Japan's first gourmet magazine, which was also called Kuidoraku. Another side of this were cookbooks written for the home chef, specifically for women. And remember that term kate, or home, household? Well, it appears in many titles of cookbooks. So here's a few of these pedagogical cookbooks that are to teach women how to cook. And a couple of things we want to note here, besides the word kate appearing. Note the fact that there are 3 meals mentioned in 2 of the titles. In other words, it becomes a new standard that you can't just serve leftovers all the time. There needs to be something called lunch that develops. So many of these cookbooks will teach specifically women what lunch is and how lunch has to be a separate meal. Something that cannot just be leftovers from breakfast or the night before. So here's one example of a lunch menu from Akiho Masumi's Healthy Japanese and Western Food. Let's take a look at it closely. First of all, Who is the author? Well, Akiho Masumi was a cookbook writer, but also she owned a cookbook school in Tokyo. Oh, excuse me, where he owned a cookbook school in Tokyo, which he opened in 1904, where he taught women how to make Japanese and Western style dishes. And he teaches his readers not just how to prepare certain recipes, but also the fact that food needs to be served at certain times of the day. He says that you have to have a clock in your kitchen. So here we have again the importance of technology, just like Murai Gensai was emphasizing technology in the kitchen. So was Akio Masumi. You need to have a clock in the kitchen so you know what time it is. And what does he suggest for lunch? Well, lunch menu consists of rice, a soup made of white miso, fish roe, and vegetables. Sounds very good. And then I'm going to butcher the name here is côtelettes champignons. Let's say I pronounced that correctly. Well, what is that? That's the meat of chicken meat, but it's been cut into long, thin slices, sprinkled with salt, covered with egg yolk, and then rolled in soft breadcrumbs to coat, and then fried. So very sophisticated fried chicken dish. He offers a salad as well and pickles. So this is a very elaborate meal. So this is kind of a fundamental shift in perspective. Why do something so complicated for lunch? Well, two reasons. First of all, it's to teach people new methods. That's one goal of these pedagogical cookbooks. If you add the meal of lunch, you have suddenly a wider understanding of food, more opportunities to learn recipes and the like. But second of all, I think it's about raising the bar for cooking at a daily level. So it's on the one hand part of the pedagogical trend in cooking and cookbooks in this period, teaching people what to do, but also trying to make the menus, trying to make the daily meals more gourmet. And some authors really take this to an extreme. So for example, we see that with the first bento cookbook. Now bento, of course, are boxed lunches, and we saw an early example, actually a later example earlier in the lecture from 1931, which was just simply leftovers. And that's what most people ate historically in their bento, is leftovers. But here with this author named Fujimura Munetaru, he's really raising the bar with the first cookbook specifically for making bento, called Convenient Daily Guide to Bento Making, which came out in 1905. His work really starts a boom in recipes for bento. And that's something that was found in other cookbooks, but also newspapers and magazines. And it carries on to this day. If you go to a Japanese bookstore, there's hundreds and hundreds of books about bento. And his is the first. He has very special rules for how to make a bento. So for example, you don't want to put a lot of gooey foods in your bento. You don't want to have foods that have a tendency to spoil. But above all, he stresses the appearance of the bento. It's got to look good. It's got to be eaten with the eye first before it is with the mouth. And the thing about Fujimura, he didn't have any photographs in his book, but he has very thick descriptions about what the bento is supposed to look like. So for example, here's his example of the importance of a bento container. Not even just the food, but the container itself is important, according to Fujimura. I'll read this after I take a sip of Junmai Ginjo. Excuse me. In bento cooking, one must pay absolute attention to the appearance of any bento, including the lunches for low-paid office workers. Even if no one values these or even criticizes the need for something that looks so beautiful, in essence, a bento is a single container with all the foods placed inside it, and sometimes the contents may become disordered. One packs a bento in the morning and arranges the contents carefully, but when the bento is opened to be eaten, If everything looks like a complete mess, there will not be any incentive to touch it with one's chopsticks. So one must pay utmost attention to these matters for bento. Again, we're kind of a revolutionary step away from just throwing leftovers in a box or wherever. A bento has to look good in order to taste good, according to Fujimura. And oh my gosh, his recipes, what did they include for his bento? Ugh, such tasty ingredients such as lobster, ham, matsutake mushrooms, which are kind of like the morels of Japan. Excellent, the most sought after mushrooms. And he suggests, that people pack these lunches full of delicacies. And he has lots of suggestions about food pairings. So, for example, he suggests pairing perilla with grilled fish or Venus clams, and suggests that the vegetable called arrowheads are very good for fish or fowl. All sorts of things. These are these are Michelin star bento by any stretch of the imagination. This is not something you just give Junior to take to school. But according to Fujimura, this is something that housewives should be thinking about making their husbands to take to work. So we've really raised a bar here compared to previous bento historically. And of course, the task of making beautiful, artful, healthy bento continues today for mothers who have to make lunches, bento lunches for their children in kindergarten. And this can be very, very stressful. A wonderful article, a very famous article by Ann Allison about this topic of mothers and kindergarten bento. And it's very serious stuff. I made bento for my daughter when we were in Japan together. And it's amazing. After school, my daughter's she's in kindergarten, she's having separation anxiety from me during the day. She doesn't speak the language. But the only thing that the teacher talks to me about is the quality of my bento. But this was a benign school, according to some schools. According to some stories I heard, the teachers will actually post comments about the bento for all to see. So it becomes a matter of public shame. So it's very stressful for mothers to make bento. It's almost about training the mother to be a mother rather than just trying to get something nice for the child to eat. And Allison makes a beautiful argument in that way. So I'll have a listing of her article at the end. You definitely want to read that. And no discussion of bento would be complete without looking at these cute types of bento. And there's all sorts of ones out there on the internet meant to appeal to kindergarteners or whoever, meant to represent characters, and they've really become works of art, almost too good to eat. Eaten by the eye. Well, we can thank Fujimura and the gourmet boom of the Meiji period in part for some of that. Here's where some of the ideas of the lecture came from. And Allison's wonderful article about bento, but also references to Kashya Sorka's Modern Japanese Cuisine and my own Japan's Cuisines, Food, Place, and Identity. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions or comments, do reach out to me. Glad to hear from you. Take care.